Helen Leone Dymond was a 48-year-old from Tilden Township, Michigan. She loved parties, but her number one job was always being a mother. On the evening of June 28, 1981, she and her husband got into a short argument at a private gathering. He drove home while she decided to stay. After midnight, Helen left, intending to walk to her son's house less than a mile away. She was never seen again. I'm Ed Densel, and this is Unfound. As I get older, I've begun to realize how fortunate I was to have known my grandparents. Granted, since I'm no youngster, they've been gone for a while now. They all died between the years of 1985 and 1997. But over the last 20 years, I've discovered that my experience was more the exception than the rule. I'm not sure a majority of people get to know their pops and grams like I did. It helped that they all lived to be at least 80 years old, and they didn't live far away. What it means is I don't have to go into the past to figure out who they were. In fact, because I actually did meet them and talk to them, I can tap my memory and it's like they're still here in the present. But in Helen Dymond's case, most of her grandchildren didn't get the chance I did. What most of them have instead are secondhand stories from their parents, aunts, and uncles. In addition to news account after news account since 1981, reminding these children of the woman they should have known, but didn't, due to whatever happened on a dark road in Michigan on June 29th of that year. What you'll hear today is one granddaughter's journey into the past, to find out what happened, along the way finding out more about her grandmother, the woman she never knew. And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Goodsite, charlieproject.org. Helen and her husband Roy went to a gathering at the Tilden Township Club on June 28, 1981. They both had a little too much to drink, and a party-goer offered to give them a ride home. They declined, and the couple walked to their car. However, before they could get into their car, the two got into an argument which caused Helen to go back inside the establishment. She said that Roy had left her behind. Helen decided to stay a little while longer, then told everyone she would walk to her son's about a mile away when she was ready to leave. This was not unusual, as she had walked to her son's after arguments in the past. Well into the early morning of June 29th, Helen left the building and started her walk, after once again refusing a ride from friends. Multiple witnesses saw her walking down the dark road, headed in the direction of her son's. Distressingly, she was walking on the wrong side of the road, and most likely legally drunk. She was never seen again. A search at the time of her disappearance yielded nothing but a woman's loafer, yet this could not be proven to be Helen's. 2 months later, a purple jacket, similar to the one Helen was wearing, was found lying on a footpath off of Country Road 476 West, not far from where Helen vanished. The belief is that it hadn't been there since the night Helen disappeared. However, the police decided that this wasn't Helen's, yet the family believes otherwise due to some of its unique features. Helen's family does not believe she left by choice. Instead, they believe some type of foul play was involved. Her case remains unsolved. The interview for this episode is with Helen's granddaughter, Holly Letson. Unfound News. If you're a member of the Unfound podcast discussion group, then you already know. But if you aren't, then I guess you'll hear it for the first time right now. Mary Lyle, mother of Suzanne Lyle, will be writing the foreword to the first book in the Unfound series. She has been so helpful to the program over the past year, and I'm very honored to have this contribution from her. The back cover will also have a couple blurbs from a few people you know, but I don't want to jinx it right at this second. Also, hey, I once again get to mention the discussion group and the first book. I leaked a tentative cover for it this past week. Granted, I've changed the color since then, and the pictures I used were from recent episodes, whereas the book series will start with the first 6 cases featured on Unfound. But the response was very positive. It's just taken more time than I thought to bring everything together. I have a lot on my plate right now, not to mention producing a new episode every week. Finally, the Patreon account and the new website should be online in the next couple days. Just one level to start on Patreon, with more tiers to come as more things become available. And the new website will have an email sign up where you can get to hear some in-depth analysis on a case that you've all heard of but haven't heard covered quite this way. I hope you find it informative. Where you can find Unfound. On Facebook, the Unfound Podcast discussion group. On Twitter, @Unfound Podcast. On Instagram, @Unfound Podcast. On YouTube, the Unfound Podcast channel. I hope to be updating that soon once I get some of these other things off my plate. The email address, unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. You can subscribe at Podomatic, Stitcher, and iTunes. You can also find Unfound on TuneIn Radio. And also please mention Unfound at WebSleuths, Reddit, podcasts we listen to, true crime podcasts, and all other true crime websites and forums. I'm very happy to have on this episode of Unfound the granddaughter of Helen Dymond, Holly Letson. Holly, welcome to Unfound.
Thank you.
Tell the listeners what you've learned about your grandmother. You did not know her. You were only a year old. That's a little bit of a unique experience on Unfound because most of the family members that I talk to, their daughters or sons or parents or siblings, it's a unique experience that I'm talking to a family member who you never got to know her. What has that been like for you in this journey? We'll start out with that.
Okay. I guess I never really knew much about her when I was really young. My mom didn't talk about her a whole lot, understandably. And so it wasn't until I was a little bit older, I want to say maybe around 7, 8, and could maybe kind of understand a little bit more. And I think I had heard it from some cousins, kind of hearing things about her disappearing, which of course when you're 7, 8 is, you kind of have a different feeling of what that means. And I guess I really didn't understand. And then as I got older, kind of each year, and it would be around like the anniversary of when she disappeared, and it was really the only time my mom ever brought her up. And so I would learn just a little bit more about her kind of each year. And as I got older and older, I would start to ask more questions. And then when I kind of finally realized that my mom was pretty okay talking about her, that it wasn't like super, super sensitive for her, that she was able to talk to her without, breaking down, and that, she'd get emotional, but, she was okay. Then I really started asking even more questions, stuff about the disappearance, but then, personal questions too, like what, obviously like what was she like and things like that. So I guess I kind of feel like I got to know her over the years that way, even though I didn't get to know her, and I was just kind of felt kind of robbed that, I didn't have, my grandma in my life, and, it was pretty unfair. So I wanted to find out as much as I could about her.
And just to be clear, you were approximately 1 year old when she disappeared.
Yep, I would have turned 1 in March, yep.
Okay. Does she have other grandchildren? How many grandchildren does she have besides yourself?
She has, she's got the 4 children, my mom and 3 siblings. She has, now she has 14 grandchildren. She's got 21 great-grandchildren and 10 great-great-grandchildren. Oh, so she would have a pretty big family for sure.
Oh, my. But just to be clear again, besides yourself, how many other grandchildren are there, to remind the listeners maybe of that number?
There's 14 total, so me and 13 others.
Okay. What do you think about yourself made you the one that has kind of headed this up?
I really don't know. I feel like I've always liked a good mystery. She and I kind of have that in common, I guess. She liked mystery novels, and she liked mystery TV programs and stuff. And I didn't find that out until later, but I've always kind of been drawn to that kind of a thing. So it always really intrigued me growing up. And, so I think what drove me the most, though, were when my mom would bring it up each year, and we'd, as I said, when I got older, I'd ask more questions, and I always just was kind of blown away, and I always kind of found myself saying, why didn't they do more? And, the police or anybody, or, like, why doesn't anybody go and ask that? Or why doesn't, and I just felt frustrated and so I don't know, I finally felt like I needed to start recording all of this. I would write down stuff that my mom would tell me, or talking with my dad and hearing stories that he had. I finally started writing it all down, and I just kind of thought I wanted the whole. When I started, I just wanted the whole story, just for posterity, for the future of grandchildren, great grandchildren, great great grandchildren, that when they learned about this, that it wasn't just just a blip, right? They'd have like a full story, and that's kind of how it started.
Yeah, you told me that you started what I guess the word would be working on this in depth was in 2004, right?
Yes. Yep.
2004. So you've had these about 13 years of working on this. You already mentioned that maybe you had in common that you and your grandmother both have this interest in mysteries. What
Hmm.
else can you tell the listeners that you've learned about your grandmother, and do you see other traits that she had that you also have now?
Yeah, I guess she was really big into watching baseball. We are a baseball, softball, I should say, family. Like the kids all played, and now all the grandkids do. We're most of the grandkids and great grandkids, and it's just been kind of something our whole family does. So I feel like that's big for all of us. She loved games. They'd have game night, where she really loved playing cribbage. It was one of the things she was doing that day. Earlier in the day when she was at a picnic, she was, playing cribbage with some friends and that. And she loved canasta. My mom taught me how to play canasta, and I love it. It's one of my favorite games too. And so I can kind of see myself in her in those ways. Just family traits, or just how we were raised and stuff. And I'm sure that my mom has passed on a lot of her to both me and my sister. So
Did she work outside of the home, or is she a housewife?
she had at one point, like years before, but not at that time. It had been, quite a few years, prior to when she disappeared, that she had ever worked. So she was at home, at that time.
Maybe I should ask this, being that she has so many grandchildren. Did any of the grandchildren get to what I would say know her? Were any of them old enough at that time before she disappeared to really have some conversations with her, or were they all like young like you?
No, I definitely have some older cousins and that knew her really well. My mom's sister Judy, her kids were older, so they got a chance. They got to know her pretty well. I know my Auntie Judy's oldest daughter. Her name is Tammy, and I've talked to her quite a bit about my grandma. Just she spent a lot of time with my grandma and grandpa, and really got to know them and really got to know my grandma and stuff. She would have been, I think, I don't want to be wrong here, but I think she was about 13 at the time that my grandma disappeared.
So, what have you learned in doing this work for over a decade now? What was going on in your grandma's life around that time, in the maybe days, weeks, months before she disappeared?
I guess just kind of life as normal for them. They'd go out, they'd, spend time and, doing just kind of the things that were happening that day. They were at a picnic, they were at a township picnic that day. And, like I said, just having game nights like normal. And, and it came up in the police report. And of course, so I talked to my mom about it. It talked about, when she was initially reported missing, they asked the same thing, of course, anything major going on, like health wise or anything like that. And, nothing alarming. It wasn't anything that was, that made them think like, oh my gosh, she, completely went off and, did whatever. It was nothing to that degree. So kind of just pretty much life as usual.
And maybe we should talk about her husband, your grandfather, Roy. What can you tell the listeners about him? You of course got to know him because he didn't pass away until 2005.
Unfortunately, I can't say, I can't really say too much. Unfortunately, I didn't get to know my grandpa as well as maybe some of the other grandchildren did. I know he was close with some of his grandsons. They'd go hunting with him and, stuff. So they had like those things to kind of bond over, where, I never really kind of found that with him. I just, from what I remember of him, just kind of thinking back to like Christmases spent there, or if we'd stop there after church on a Sunday, and that I remember him, me personally, as being kind of quiet. I don't know if my other members of my family would agree with that assessment, but that's just kind of how I personally remember him.
How far away did you live from your grandfather?
Not far,
Not far.
only about a mile. I just kind of feel like, just kind of got wrapped up in my own life. And like I said, it was always, like birthdays and holidays and stuff like that. I always, definitely saw him then, but not too much beyond that. And, for whatever reasons, we just didn't. I don't know. I know my mom would talk to him from time to time on the phone, and it's like I said, it's not like I never went there or anything. I remember he'd watch us. There was a couple of times like after school that we would go there, where he would watch us. But I remember him sitting just quietly in his chair, and I would sit and read a book or whatever, and that's just kind of how it went.
That's just kind of the relationship you had.
It was, yeah. We weren't really chatty with each other by any means.
So what happened that day? Technically June 28th, 1981. What can you tell the listeners about that day, that evening, of what your grandmother and your grandfather did?
Okay, so earlier that day, so it would have been a Saturday. There was a picnic going on right there in National Mine. It was a township picnic. I remember going to them when I was younger. After I got a little bit older, it was held every year. And so, everybody just kind of gathered up. The people of National Mine called it the flats. They would gather up at the flats. It was like a ball field there. There were horseshoe pits there and picnic tables and such, and that everybody would gather up there and, grilling and, hot dogs, hamburgers, that kind of stuff. And that's what they did. That's where they went that day. Like I said, she was, somebody contacted me, said, I remember, playing cribbage, with Helen that day. And so just kind of enjoying it, my grandpa playing horseshoes, and so they were there, during the day. As it got, closer to the evening, my uncle, her son, had a baseball game, that was, in town, which wasn't that far away from where they were. And so, they wanted to, she really wanted to make sure they got to that because, like I said, it was something she really, really enjoyed. So they did go there, and then came back to the picnic. And then from there, I guess maybe around like 8 o'clock-ish, maybe between 8 and 9 o'clock, that's when they headed to the club, the Tilden Township Club, which was a private club in National Mine. So in order to go, you'd have to be a member or you'd have to be a guest, of members. And my parents were members, so they were there that night as guests of my parents. Just so at the club, I guess to kind of take you through the part of the night that we know, they were there drinking and that. And as it was getting a little bit later, my mom and dad wanted to head into town to go and get pizza. We have a popular pizza place in town here that's frequented, and it's called the Congress. So they were going to go to the Congress and get a pizza, and they invited my grandma and grandpa to go with. And I guess my grandma kind of really wanted to go, and my grandpa was like, well, no, we can't afford it, and that. And I guess my parents offered, well, don't worry about it, but just kind of proud people, they turned it down. So my parents left. They went to go get pizza. My grandma and grandpa stayed at the club until pretty late. The time frame is a little iffy. I can get into that a little bit, but I want to say maybe around 2:30-ish.
In the morning.
Grandpa was in the morning, yeah.
So they were staying out really late. This would have been into Sunday morning then.
Yes, yep, into Sunday morning. And my grandpa was ready to leave. I guess. I mean, I don't know much else other than what the people who were left at the club said. he was ready to leave. I guess they both went out to the parking lot. There was an argument. People heard them arguing. I don't know to like really what degree, if screaming, yelling, or just, well, I want to go. No, I don't want to go. She wanted to stay longer, and he was like, well, okay, then you can walk home. And he took off, and she came back or you had to ring to get in, you had to buzz to get in. So she buzzed to get back in. They let her in, and he left me, and I guess she stayed for a while. Not too much longer. According to the people who were left there, they said she really didn't stay much longer. And then she left, and as she was leaving, she, kind of said to the people left, I'm headed to my son's. There were people that offered her a ride. There were a couple different couples that offered her a ride, and she declined, and it really wasn't that far. He lived only about a mile away, which was kind of really nothing. And she was like, nope, I'm just headed to my son's. And she took off, and it really is, it's the club is just down a road. I mean, it's almost like right on the main road, but it juts off onto this little side road. So it would have taken, 20 seconds maybe to walk from the club to the main road. She would have had to take a right to head to her son. So she would have taken a right and started walking down the road. A couple stopped at that point soon after she had turned onto the main road. She had walked just a little ways, and they were heading in that direction. So they stopped and, asked if she wanted a ride, and she declined. They did note in the police report she was walking on the right-hand side of the road. So she was walking on the wrong side of the road.
So she was walking with traffic in contrast against traffic.
With traffic, yeah. So she's walking with traffic, and that was potentially the last time anybody saw her. I mean, that we know of for sure with 100% certainty. I guess it was at that point, and then she never made it to her son's, and nobody really kind of knows what happened after that point for sure.
Let me ask you a few questions about that night. How often did your grandparents go to this club? They were members there. Was this like a week? Was this like a every weekend type of thing, or once a month? Do you have any ideas about that?
Nope, they weren't members. My parents were members.
Their
so
parents.
They went that night.
Okay.
Yep, my parents were members, so they went that night as guests, and I actually just asked my mom about this. And my mom thinks that could possibly be the first time they had ever been there. She doesn't recall them being there any other time. Whether she's right or wrong, I don't know. But like I said, you had to be, with somebody that belonged to the club. But to her knowledge, it may have been the first time they had ever been there. So definitely not a place that they frequented often.
So these other people that were at this club necessarily weren't friends. I mean, they might have known your grandparents, but they were members of the club. Your grandparents aren't. So they might not know them, but just acquaintances. I wouldn't say they were close friends. These people might have known your parents better.
Yeah, I mean, some of them I would say, would have considered them friends. I'm trying to remember, one of the ladies that my grandma was sitting with at the club would have definitely considered her a friend. And you got to remember, this is a very, very, very small area. My grandparents lived in National Mine for many, 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 many years. And where they moved to, it wasn't far away from where they had lived, like where my mom and her siblings grew up. They grew up, I talked about that main road that cuts through National Mine. That's the road that they grew up on. And so, these are all like National Mine people, even if they weren't living right in National Mine anymore. So they would have definitely known everybody in that club, and everybody there would have known them for sure.
Now, this is out there, and I'm going to ask you about this. Your grandfather possibly said something to your grandmother with that, are you going to do this to me again? They were having this argument. Is that true? Do you believe that to be true? Is that on the record? Or is that just like a rumor that is circulated throughout the years that maybe they had an argument like this before about maybe both of them, having a couple drinks? What do you know about that?
I know that they fought. I don't think that's any big secret.
Hmm.
And according to my mom, it was usually only when they were drinking that they would get into these little spats and stuff. And so I don't think any of it was really unusual. And I don't think anybody in the family really took it as anything too alarming that he got mad and left and that, and she was just kind of like, well, fine, you know what I mean, I'll walk to Roy's and so be it, you know what I mean, and then deal with it tomorrow when we're sober, kind of a thing, right?
Had she
So
walked to your I guess it would be your uncle's, her son's, before?
that I'm not sure about. I know, we've had other family members that, lived in National Mine. And there's another subdivision not far from there. It's called Salisbury, and she had family that lived in Salisbury too. And according to my mom, on a few different occasions, one time she, walked to, so and so's house. It was her my mom's sister's in-laws that she ended up at one time, and they were just kind of wondering, well, where is she? And that's where she ended up being. She was just cooling off, kind of a thing, and I guess sometimes she would go to her sister's house, and that I can't. I don't know. This could be over the course of several years. I don't. This wasn't. She never made it sound like this was something that was like every weekend. She was like taking off and like going to somebody's house just to like have that cooling off period. I never got the sense that it was something like that. It was just, on occasion kind of a thing. And
So what you're saying is just once in a while, could have been once a year, could have been once every 6 months. Maybe your grandparents are out, they have a little bit of an argument, and your grandmother's like, well, if you're going to be like that, then I'm walking home. And she could, and being that this isn't a very big area, she could go to one of a variety of people's houses because everybody kind of knew each other in this little community. It could have been your uncle's, could have been anybody's house.
right. And I mean, yeah, but no, I never got the sense that it was like a super common thing that went on anyway.
And just to reiterate, how far was it from that club to where your uncle lived, her son lived?
It was about a mile. My sister and I actually walked it a while back. We just curious, like, because there's a big hill that you got to walk up and everything, and so we were just like, well, let's just see, just for fun, like, how long should it have taken her? And my sister and I walked it at, the kind of a very natural pace, and it took us just a little over 13 minutes.
And along that road, maybe just to describe it for the listeners, just in the very, very close vicinity, because we are going to talk about some bodies of water here eventually, but just along which she had to gone close to a pond, to a creek, anything like that, that she could have possibly fallen into, anything like that.
Nothing that she would have fallen into. No, nothing where if she would have like stepped off onto the side of the road, there were no like creeks or anything like that she could have like fallen into, and something like that happened. Not on that stretch. No.
Now, when did people start getting worried about your grandmother? Maybe we should start with this. Your grandfather ended up making a call to your mother. Maybe start there, and then maybe you can just continue from there. As like what went on from that time.
Talking to both my mom and my dad, both kind of like narrowed it down to about 3:30 in the morning. About 3:30 in the morning, my grandpa called their house. They've always assumed that he called there because he called while my dad was out dropping the babysitter off. So they had a babysitter for me and my sister. My sister's about a year and a half older than I am. So we're just little, and they had gotten a babysitter that night, and the babysitter actually lived directly across the street from my grandparents. And so, my dad drives the babysitter home, and they've always kind of speculated, well, it's probably why they called them, because he, probably heard the car, kind of waiting for, my grandma to come home, thinking like, is she getting a ride from somebody? Is she walking? He didn't know that her plan was to walk to my uncle's house that night. So, probably heard the car and was like, looking, seeing if it's her coming, and then would have seen that it was my dad bringing the babysitter home. Then he calls my parents' house and asks is Ma with you? Is, my grandma with my parents? And my mom's like, well, no, we haven't seen her since we left, when we left you guys at the club when we went to go for pizza. My mom kind of feels like, did he assume that the reason why they were getting home so late was because they had gone back to the club, gone for pizza, gone back to the club, of course, ran into my grandma there. Was he hoping that that's, when he saw my parents' car, like, oh, are they bringing her home? And so when he just goes to the neighbor's house and then drives away, he calls my parents and, asks, is she with them? My mom was like, nope. Like I said, the last time they had seen her was when they left them at the club. And so, my mom talked to my grandpa for a while, and, he was like, well, where she could be, where is she and everything. And my mom was like, don't worry about it. I'm sure she probably got a ride to somebody's house, whether it was Betty's, her sister, or wherever. And she said, don't worry about it. She's like, we'll figure it out in the morning. And, I guess he asked at one point, he's like, well, should I go out and, look for her or whatever? Like, if she's walking, go and get her. My mom's like, no, just leave her. Well, like I said, if she's not home, in the morning or, by, noon or lunch or whatever, she's like, if she's not home by then, she's like, I'll call around for the people left at the club that we know that were left at the club. And I'll see if she, just, got a ride with any of them or, went with any of them or whatever. I asked my mom, I was like, do you feel like he went out? Do you think he ever went out looking? And my mom's like, no, I really don't. By the time she got off the phone with him, she's like, I feel like I convinced him, just go to bed, sleep it off, and we'll find her in the morning. And
to your knowledge, did your grandfather, in these times that your grandmother stayed at other houses, in any of that time, do you ever remember him calling your house during those times?
I guess I couldn't answer that one. I guess I'd have to ask my
just
mom,
don't know.
but I don't.
So just a couple things about maybe we don't unfortunately have a map to route all of this, but your parents are out, they drive home, and then he takes your babysitter home and then comes back. Right. In any of those roads, would they have been on the same road that your grandmother would have been walking that night around the same time?
I mean, unless she decided to walk all the way home, no. Which, I mean, was doubtful. I mean, especially since she told everybody there she was going to her son's house anyway. But no, they wouldn't have gone through National Line to take the route home that they needed to go home. They would have taken another road that would have led them directly to their house. That would have been a very roundabout way of my parents getting home.
Okay. So they wouldn't have had the opportunity to pass her if she'd have been on the road somewhere. That just would not have happened.
No.
Okay. So that next day, everybody gets up. Your grandfather takes your mother's advice, maybe goes to bed, or maybe he sits up all night. We don't know, but he didn't call anybody else. Your mother, maybe, as she said, she wasn't too worried about it. It's happened maybe once or twice before. But then we get to noon. What starts happening then?
Usually on Sundays, and I remember this from when I was little too, but usually on Sundays, we would end up at my other grandma's house, my dad's mom, because we literally lived right next door to them. I don't know. I have to find out. I don't know if he, finally got a hold of her there, or if she, after they ate, if she called to see if she had gotten home yet or anything, and so it was at that time then that she learned that no, she hadn't, and that's when she started making phone calls. She was calling everybody that she could remember that had been left at the club, like when they left, trying to think of anybody that had still been there with my grandparents. And I asked her, I said, well, was Grandpa calling people or anything? And she's like, no. And I was like, well, why not? And she's like, well, because he was pretty down for the count. I guess, when he'd be drinking, he would be pretty pretty rough the next
Down,
day
yeah,
anyway.
yeah.
And so she's like, I just kind of told him I'd take care of it. I'd call, and she said that she kept calling him throughout the day with like updates, like, hey, talk to so and so, and they didn't see her, or they haven't talked to her, and so she kind of kept calling him throughout the day with updates. Well, then as it kind of got later,
Did any of these people they talked to, any of these people who maybe they got in contact with some of these people that were at the club that night, did any of them say, well, you know, she said she was going to walk to her son's? Did that come up that day, or when did your mother, or whoever else, find out that that was your grandma's plan?
That I'm not sure. I guess I can't answer that one. I don't know if it was exactly that day, or maybe in the course of, you know, the next 24 hours or so that did finally come out. I would think that it would have came out pretty early, just because she was calling the people who were there, and they were people who would have heard that. She herself would have called, you know, my uncle, and, you know, talked to him and found out, you know, did Ma ever show up? Did you ever hear a door? I mean, you gotta, you know, just so many different scenarios that they probably kind of ran through. So
But you were under
like
the
I said, I don't think
impression
it was
that
like a
not
week
even,
later.
but not, you were under the impression that not even your grandfather knew that that was her plan to walk there. They had this
No, I
argument,
mean,
but we don't know what was said to each other. You know, I'm under the impression that that's not what she said to him.
right? Yeah, and I don't believe that was, you know what I mean. I don't think that was relayed between the two of them at that point. Now, at what point did she make that decision? You know, did she make it as she was walking out the door? Like, where do I want to go? Do I want to walk to Salisbury to my sister's house, or do I want to walk, you know, a mile down the road to Roy's house? Or, you know, I don't know when she would have made that decision. And you're right, I couldn't say if anything was said to him when they were out in the parking lot. I guess I just never got that sense. I feel like when he called my mom, he would have been like, well, she said she was going to Roy's. But my mom never said anything like that ever came up in that conversation. So I'm assuming it probably came out that next day as they were calling around and talking to everybody that they could remember, you know, and kind of going from there. And of course, at that point, she would have talked to my Uncle Roy and found out that she indeed did not ever show up there, which I'm sure caused more alarm at that point. And
Sure.
so I know my mom started to get really worried, like that evening. And, you know, as she's always said, like in her mind, she just kind of kept thinking, well, I have to wait 24 hours before we call the police. And she ended up calling the police before the 24 hours were up, because that night, which would have been Sunday night, there was, you know, the weather forecast was calling for a really bad thunderstorm. And so she was worried. She was concerned about that. I think I would think the same thing. Like, I wouldn't want her out there and all of a sudden this big thunderstorm comes through or something. So she was worried enough to call it in anyway. To my knowledge, you know, that next day, even before they called the police, I know that, you know, my dad and, you know, a friend of his went driving along, you know, where she could have been walking that day, along that main road and National Line. They were, you know, taking a drive to see if they could see anything unusual, like skid marks on the road, or, you know, could they find like her glasses or something that, you know, had she been struck, right, that they maybe could find some type of evidence, which is probably good that they went and did that, since that storm was coming through and could have washed away any of that type of evidence.
And there's a lot of woods around here. I mean, to put a search together, I mean, it's not like it's in a city. You get off the main road, it's trees. It's the
It's
wilderness.
trees.
And
There's a lot of trees. There's a lot of woods. Yeah.
yeah, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, of course. But did the police organize something? Did your family? I mean, I guess it would be a little hard to even know where to start, but I'm sure they did do something walking around in the woods somewhere.
Well, if you talk to my family, this is a pretty kind of a bitter subject for everybody. Everybody I've talked to, you know, the police involvement and what they were willing to do and put forth the effort on. a lot of the initial searching was just done by, family members. A lot of it, my dad was kind of, spearheading a lot of different things. And my dad went to like the radio stations and stuff to have them announce that they were gonna, everybody was gonna meet at the club, and to they forming like their own search party, and calling for people to come and meet if they wanted to come and help out to look for her. And according to my dad, he said it was kind of when the police kind of got word of that, then they kind of showed up to kind of help with the search then. I know my dad even at one point, him and a friend actually rented a plane and flew over the area. There's a lot of pits. This is like open mining, open pits that are now filled. And so there's pits in the area that have now filled up with water. And so they wanted to do like a flyover on these pits to see if they saw anything, a body floating or saw anything unusual. But that was my dad that organized that as well. I guess search and rescue finally brought in dogs about like a week later.
What was your grandfather doing at this time? How was he reacting? What was he saying about all this? Obviously, he would be the person who is number one affected by all this. What have you been,
Right.
obviously, what have you been told, being, once again, you were just 1 year old at the time?
He was very distraught, wanted to know where she was, helping in these searches. One of my favorite stories is him and my dad on like a 90-degree day traipsing through swampy woods, just kind of looking and searching. And I guess he ended up getting bit by somebody's dog. And I guess he was, very antsy, couldn't sit still. He'd want to get in his car.
Obsessed?
Maybe. I guess, just kind of the way my mom has described it to me, just, would fixate on, different things. And, he'd want her to go for a ride with him, see if, they'd drive around National Mine, see if, they could see anything. He was, kind of creeping slowly, going by people's houses, thinking maybe they were keeping her inside. They were like hiding her or something. And he just kept looking, like, you know what I mean? Like, and he'd go, different places. This was, of course, right before the 4th of July. And my mom said, it's kind of unusual. Like, so, he went to, he'd go, to these different things, which really wasn't like him, especially to go by himself. And she said he was going to see if any of these drunks in town would say anything. And so he'd kind of just go and like sit and like listen to see if anybody was talking about it. Like, he was obsessed with like trying to see if anybody was talking about that night, talking about her. Usually about a week after the 4th of July around here, one of the nearby cities does kind of their own little celebration. They call it Pioneer Days. And he went there doing the same thing, just kind of eavesdropping on conversations and listening to see if he could hear anything. Talking to my mom, and I asked her the same thing, like, what was he doing? Like, what, you know what I mean? Like, how was he feeling? How was he? And she just, the word that she used was lost. He was lost. He was lost without her. Like, she was his whole world. And he just kind of didn't know what to do. And there's a story my mom told me a few days after she disappeared, and she said that when she got out into the kitchen, she saw into the living room and saw that my grandpa was, sitting on a chair in the living room, and she said he was crying. And she said that, it's like the first time really, like in her life, she ever really saw him cry. And so it really struck her. And just kind of things he was saying, that he was just so upset. And, he just kind of kept saying, like, where could she be? Like, where could she be? And my mom said, my mom didn't really know how to handle that. There she has this parent sitting in front of her that, she'd never really ever seen cry before, and very emotional in that. And so I guess she called her sister, one of her sisters, and said, you got to come here or something. I kind of don't know what to do right now. And I think we all kind of need to deal with this. And she said that's when they kind of called family over, and that, I don't know, like powwow, kind of maybe figure out what do we do next? Where do we go from here? Are we missing something? Like I said, the word she used was lost. He felt very lost.
You had mentioned the police. You had mentioned that they had a flyover looking at some of these pits. There is a particular pit story that I think is an interesting moment. And they were going to drain one of these pits. When did this happen, and why didn't it happen?
I'm not exactly sure just how long after she disappeared. I'd have to double check on that, but I don't think it was too long. These pits, of course, this property and everything is owned by the mining company that runs the mines here locally. The one in National Mine and the one nearby. They're kind of connected, but two big mines here anyway. And they own that property. And so my dad, he worked for the local power company, the Upper Peninsula Power Company. And so they had it set up with Cleveland Cliffs. That's the name of the mining company, was Cleveland Cliffs, that they were going to take and drain, one of those main pits that are right there. They would need to have, they'd have to pump the water out. They were going to set up a station across the street. And this is like just down the road from where she would have been walking. So if you remember, I said that she would have to take and turn up a hill to get to her son's house. Well, if you go down the road just a little bit more, just around the corner, there's a pit that's visible from the road.
So like a quarter of a mile, a half a mile?
Not even. It's
okay.
literally just right around the corner. And so, the idea is to drain the pit. Now, whether it's because it was right there in that vicinity, but the idea would be that when you drain one, they're like all connected. So draining one would actually lower the levels in all the pits, which would then help in any search. Like if she happened to be in any other nearby pit, it would help a search effort in nearby pits as well. And my dad, working for the power company, he had it set up with the power company, and they were going to take and provide the power to run this pump to take and drain the pit. So everything was kind of set up. The police put a stop to it because they had gotten some complaints. There was, somebody that lived like near the pit who had a pond also right there, and of course it would have affected the pond. It would have lowered the levels there too, and I guess she was upset about her ducks. That's what my dad says anyway. She was upset about her ducks, and she was complaining and stuff, and they talked about environmental, like they didn't want to like harm any of this stuff, and the police came in and just they put a stop to it, and so then that never happened.
And when you say that never happened, not only did it not happen that day, it didn't happen the next week, it didn't happen the next year, and that has never happened in 36 years.
Happened.
Never.
No.
And nobody thought of maybe just sending a scuba diver down or something like that over the years? Do you have any ideas about any of that?
Not a clue. I know, like when I, just recently, like thinking about these pits, and I actually kind of, took a walk back there and was exploring, and that just kind of checking out these pits myself. And, I kind of thought like, well, can't we send somebody down there now? Like, and either that or, there's like the underwater devices you can like send down
drone.
there, right?
Sure, drone,
right?
Sure.
I don't know. And so, I kind of thought about that, and I actually have a friend, she's actually a former student of mine from years ago. A friend of mine, she knows some people that work in search and rescue today. And I guess she brought it up with one of her friends in search and rescue, and they kind of were just telling her that, not really sure what you would find today, with like one of those underwater things, or, even a scuba diver going down there, only because, with all the foliage each year and, landing in it and settling in it, that, not that it's totally off of my list of possibilities in the future, but I could see what they were saying. I could see where they were coming from. What would you find, and would you have to? I just kind of feel like, would we really have to kind of know if her body was dumped in one of these pits. And like I said, and there's one of them that there's like the one that's right next to the road, the one that, kind of everybody kind of refers to. There's the one that's right next to the road, but then there's one behind it too that's accessible from a path in the woods along the route she would have been walking that night. And that one's huge. It's really big. And so I almost kind of feel like you'd have to have an idea of if her body was dumped in one of those pits, you'd almost have to kind of know where it was in order to really kind of truly be able to search efficiently.
Well, it would be
And
nice
so
if somebody would give it at least a shot. I'm just saying this is just an
I would love
observation,
it.
and the listeners should know that before our prior conversation, my conversation with Holly, we had talked about this. I just wanted to make sure the listeners might have been thinking the same thing, and that's why we have to talk about it.
Sure. Yeah,
So,
and no, they were never searched. They were never
okay.
searched.
And it was all but originally back whenever that was, probably in the 1980s, probably not long after your grandmother
Yeah, no, I know
disappeared.
it wasn't too long after she disappeared
Okay,
that
but
they
it
were
was a duck
talking about
pond.
draining the pit.
It was a duck
And
pond that got in the way.
there was the ducks. There was a little bit of wildlife, I guess, that kind of stood in the way between, and who knows what it would have yielded. But I feel like maybe it would have been maybe a little bit of peace of mind had they done it and not seen anything. You know what I mean? At least you could kind of say they did what they could. And it almost kind of felt like everything that would come up, they kind of got shut down about. So they'd hear word, and the police would say, well, she's not in the area anymore, she's long gone. And then they got word from somebody, they got a tip or whatever, that she was possibly sighted in Ashland, Wisconsin, which is in northern Wisconsin, so not too terribly far, but I mean, it's a decent drive from where we are. And they didn't want to go and look because they were like, well, no, she's long gone, like she's dead. And I guess my mom, one of the stories that really upsets my mom the most is she had plainclothes officers, probably the detectives, showed up to her house one morning, kind of conveniently waited for my dad to leave and go to work. Now, whether that's true or not, but that's how she feels, is that it was no sooner after my dad left and they showed up. And she let them in, and no sooner did they step into her home there, and they just were like, "Where's your mom? Where are you keeping her?" And my mom was like, "Really? I've been calling the police station like sometimes every hour on the hour, some days, seeing if they have any updates, and you seriously come to my house and accuse me of hiding her? That's ridiculous."
Why do you think they did? What your impression? Why do you think they did that?
My thought is, did they have a conversation with my grandpa, and did they ask, has she ever done this before? And he might have said, well, yeah, time to time, she's gone and stayed with a family member or whatever, and whether he said that or not, but I guess that kind of makes sense, that why they would like barge into her house like that and just kind of demand where she's keeping her, where she's hiding her. It just, in my mom's eyes, she's like, it just didn't fit. Like, why would I be calling you every hour finding out what's going on if she's, sitting in my back room, hiding? It just, like I said, I mean, I can look back at it now and say, like, well, maybe they were asking because they were wondering if, she was hiding or something like that, and that. But so in one breath, they were telling my family, well, she's gone, she's not in the area anymore, she took off. And then the next thing they're doing is saying, well, you're keeping her somewhere. Mm-hmm. And that, I don't know, it was just, like I said, I know it was a really upsetting time for my family, and just kind of feeling like, even like the search efforts.
It's a very common story. It happens in Michigan in 1981. It happens in Florida in 1983. It happened, all these cases. It's not just your case, and it's just not your grandmother. In almost every disappearance we cover on Unfound, lots of complaints about police not doing their jobs, not doing enough, not taking things seriously. And it's been going on for a long time, even well before your grandmother disappeared in 1981. That's just the way it is. That's just the way it is.
Yeah, yeah.
Tell
And
the
I mean, I
listen.
guess unless you experience it yourself, I just kind of feel like they experienced it themselves to kind of know what
Mhm.
that truly kind of feels like. And like I said, very
Yeah,
severe. I guess.
what I find is, and many times, especially it's going to be going back to older cases, with social media these days, I'm not sure as many families more families realize this, but maybe back then, they don't realize that the way that your family was treated back then, they probably didn't realize that probably every other disappearance that happened in Michigan in 1981, all those people got treated the same way,
Yeah.
most likely. And in 1982 and in 83, and it continues right up to this day in every state. I think, though, that people that have that happen to them now know about it a little bit more, once again, because of social media, because of Facebook, because of Twitter, and all this, where people can communicate and see what else has gone on in other cases. Back in
Right.
1981, I'm sure that your family felt very alone.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Fair
What?
statement.
Yeah. What can you tell the listeners about the purple jacket? Where was it found, and what significance does it have?
When the paper ran her story, of course they ran, this is last time she was seen and this is what she was wearing. And for quite a while, the newspaper was running an incorrect description. That could very well be my grandfather's fault. Asking her like, well, what was she wearing, and he very well may have been the one to tell them that she was wearing a maroon jacket, which is definitely a very red shade. And it wasn't. And when my mom, I don't know if it was my mom or who it was, it could be any of the relatives, but when they saw that the paper was running it that she was wearing a maroon jacket, they were like, no, she wasn't wearing a maroon jacket. That's purple. It was purple, very purple, like purple. Um, and so they kept trying to get the newspaper. It's called the Mining Journal. They kept trying to get the Mining Journal to run the correct description, and they wouldn't. So every time they'd like run this story, like, kind of giving like an update or whatever, you read in there that she was last seen wearing, blue jeans, moccasins, and a maroon jacket. And so finally, over a month goes by, a month and a half, and my grandpa actually ended up paying for an ad himself in the paper. He went and he paid for, just a little space in the paper, to, kind of like a have you seen this woman, with the correct description. That was on a Wednesday that it ran. It was Wednesday, August 19th. So like I said, about a month and a half later, Wednesday, August 19th, the correct description was run. And it was the following Tuesday, 6 days later, that a purple jacket was found. It was found, I had to try to think of, I clocked it one time to see how far away it was. It was about maybe 5 miles away from the club, where pretty much kind of where she had been seen or whatever. It was found on a little fisherman's trail, not far off the road, just a little ways on this little footpath that would take you down by the water if you were going to go fishing or something. My dad went out there to go and help them, and he said that it was just kind of laying on top of like the foliage that was up, like the ferns and stuff like that, right? It was just like it had just kind of been tossed there.
Was it dirty, or does it
And
look like it had been weathered at all?
no, and that's kind of what the police focused on. And my dad said the one officer that had it in his hands or whatever, I guess he like put it up to his nose and like smelled it and was like, nah, it's too fresh, this can't be hers. And my dad's like, what? Okay. I mean, I guess it doesn't necessarily mean it's not hers, it just maybe hasn't been out in the elements for a month and a half, right?
It's been in somebody's
And so
house, maybe.
exactly, right. It could have been anywhere. And so, of course, they take it in, they bring it in as evidence or whatever. And so they wanted, people that could come in and ID the jacket. And so, of course, my grandpa goes and about as much help as he was on what his wife was wearing. I feel like that's definitely not something my grandpa would have been paying attention to. But he said that, it was definitely a type of jacket that she did wear. They had my mom go too, and my mom said, like with certainty, my mom was like, that is her jacket. I know that is her jacket. It was a windbreaker type jacket. My mom said she distinctly remembered the buttons on the jacket. That's what stood out to her, because they were a different shade purple than the jacket itself. So it was just something that she remembered her mom's jacket, being that way. And so this jacket was exactly the same. And it also, my grandma, with those windbreaker type jackets, she hated the drawstring that was at the bottom. So she would always take and pull the drawstring out. And then, of course, this jacket also was missing the drawstring. And my mom, you talked to her today, even my mom is 100% convinced that that was her mother's jacket that she had that day, that night. They even brought my cousin Tammy, the one that was about 13, I want to say she was 13, at the time. She even went in and she positively ID'd the jacket as being my grandma's. And I just, that was it. There was like nothing else ever.
And they never saw, the police still insisted that the purple jacket was not your grandmother's, and you've never seen it again.
Hers. No, and I've even seen a note tucked in the police report in like the file that they have, saying that, Betsy has called like once again, like insisting that this is her mother's jacket, because of course they ran it in the paper. Because, of course, it made the paper that, a jacket was found that could potentially be the missing person's, or whatever. And then they ran a story saying that it indeed was not her jacket, which was really upsetting for my family. Because, like I said, my mom went in and positively ID'd it. Neither could my husband.
Do you think that the police do you think the police house still have that jacket, or do you think they disposed of it? Do you think anybody came and claimed it?
I know for a fact they do not have it. In the police report, I believe it was 1984, it was about 3 years later, that it was ordered that, all evidence in the case, since it wasn't going anywhere, there were no new leads or anything like that, that all evidence was to be destroyed. Well, there was only one piece of evidence, really, which was the jacket, that it was ordered destroyed.
Anybody take any pictures of it?
No, not to my knowledge.
You've never seen any?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I've never seen any. I know that there was a picture taken of her. Are you talking about like by the police?
I'm saying a picture like, so it's usually when they show up and it could be an evidence that's part of a crime, they would take the evidence like where it was before they would take it off the path or take it off the tree or anything else.
Right. Nothing that I have seen. I also this summer I went to our sheriff's department, which is where our search and rescue would be out of, to request any files that they maybe still had. And I was informed that all the files that they had, on missing persons, not like on murder cases or anything, but they don't keep all their files forever. They couldn't, they'd be overrun, I guess. And so, and I forget how many years it was it 2013 or I don't know how many years ago it was, but that those files had been destroyed.
Now, I want to remind the listeners that, that Unfound is not a trial. But we do talk about suspects, other possibilities of what could have happened, and all the disappearances that we cover. And as the listeners know, sometimes guests are more than willing to say what they think happened. But I just want to remind that we're going to be talking about a few people. This is not a trial. This is just things that went on after Helen's disappearance. People and other things, words that were heard that we have to talk about. But this is not a trial. But if this is public information, we have to talk about it. So I'm going to ask you about, what can you tell the listeners? You found out about the Treloar party. Treloar is a last name. It's Treloar. What was going on at the Treloar residence the night your grandmother disappeared?
So, I think it kind of came out almost right away that, a party had been taking place there kind of maybe throughout the day, evening, into the night. Kind of what, my family has heard over the years. And again, I can't say for sure, but, it was kind of, people were kind of coming and going throughout the day. It was somebody that lived there. It was their birthday that they were celebrating. And So we kind of, my family got word that, there had been this party taking place there. Well, she would have had to, why was this important? Well, she would have had to walk
Your grandmother.
right by this
Your
house.
grandmother.
Yes, my grandmother. Yep, would have had to walk right past this house. It's literally like, so where I said she would take in turn to head up to her son's house, it's like right there. The police, it's in the police report, they went and talked to the owner of the house, and, kind of, what do you remember? Who was here kind of a thing. And so, he kind of offered up, well, it was my son, my daughter, it was my son's friend. They were kind of asking, well, who was here, who would have been here at the time of night when she would have been walking on the road, right? I don't think they really, reading the police report, they didn't really ask like who all had been there that day. They were just simply focused in on when she would have been walking by. And he said, possibly the guy that lives across the street. So a small amount of people that were, would have been at the party at that time.
Did your grandmother know these people? Like, if she'd have run into them at like the grocery store, would this been any of these people that she would have maybe talked to? How well did they know her?
Yeah, she would have known.
I guess what I'm saying is, if she walks by this house, sees there's like a little party going in there, would she have felt like she was welcome to go in there because she knew them well enough, or she would say, you know what, I really don't know these people, I'm going to keep walking to my son's?
I would say that she would have, known. I would say, depending on who was potentially there. Now, according to the daughter that lived there, and I've talked to her, according to her, they were upstairs. The kids were upstairs in a bedroom, partying upstairs, doing whatever, and so, and then according to the owner of the house, he was upstairs sleeping at the time. So, but the daughter of the house said that, anybody could have walked in their house and they wouldn't have known it. And so, were there still people, was there anybody downstairs like lingering, still partying? That's kind of what we've always wondered. And so is it possible now when the owner of the house, he had mentioned Lee as a possibility, of being there, that was, it was very likely. Kind of everybody I've talked to said it's very likely that he could have been. He was kind of somebody that liked to go around looking for a party, looking for a place to hang out and drink and stuff. And he lived right across the street from them. And so, for him to say that, he was a possibility, I'd say that he probably was a really big possibility.
So your grandmother would have not only had to pass the Trelawney residence, but also his last name's Dobson, Lee Dobson's house as well. He was possibly at the party, but he not only was at the party, she would have maybe had to have walked past his house as well.
Right. Yeah. Before she got, so he's just a little. It's like kitty corner. So he would have been like on the right hand side of the road, as she was walking to her right, on the right hand side of the road, and then just a few steps down, the house would have been on the left. And so he lived just kind of kitty corner right across from them, and so she would have had to walk past his house and then walk past their house.
But just for the record, those people were talked to, and none of them saw your grandmother that night. Not only did they not see her in the house, but they didn't see her walk by either, even though that would have been the road, that would have been a house she had to have passed to get to your uncle's.
Right. And so they interviewed the owner of the house. His name was James. They interviewed James Trelawney, and he said, by that time in the morning, he was already in bed sleeping. And like I said, so he kind of offered who could have possibly been in the house at the time. I know they talked to at least his son, and then possibly the son's friend. I don't know how much they ever interviewed the daughter. Like I said, she was a little bit younger, not super young. She was a teenager, but not 18 or anything. So it's very possible they asked her questions when they were at the house there, questioning the dad and everything else and that. But They never, well, at least it's not in the police report. They never talked to Lee though. Like they never went and questioned him, even though he was mentioned as a possibility of being there. Which,
What do you
what's
want? What do you
interesting,
want to tell? What do you
oh,
want to tell the listeners about Lee Dobson?
we don't know what to think, and part of that is his own doing. That that we know that he possibly was there that night, that he possibly saw her, just because of the proximity, just because he was mentioned as possibly being there. And this is something he's kind of known to do, is go looking for a party, and if there's one right across the street, well, pretty likely. And then
He's a little bit, I guess, a little bit of the town drunk and everything, but at times when he gets drunk, he has said that he killed somebody.
he said it to my mom, actually. So he no longer drove in the 80s, and so he'd always be kind of bumming rides from people. Hey, can I get a ride home? If he was like in town drinking and so the time that my mom told me about is that he was in town drinking and they must have been at the same place, and so he asked my parents if he could get a ride home, so that would take them through National Mine. And they were like, well, that's fine, that's okay. My dad actually had to stop at the club for something anyway, and so they were like, yeah, sure, we'll give you a ride. So they get into National Mine, and my dad needs to stop at the club to, I don't know what he needed to do there, but so they stop there. My dad goes in, so it's just my mom and Lee in the car, and he's sitting in the back, and he's intoxicated, whatever. But all just totally out of the blue, he says to my mom, I killed somebody once. And my mom was just like, oh my God.
What
And
year was
she
this,
said,
do you think? What year?
and I just recently asked her that again, and she was really trying to rack her brain. I said, were you driving? She's like, God, I just don't remember.
Could she remember how
But she
old
was
you
driving.
were at the time? Was it in the 80s? Was it in the 90s? Was it in
No,
the 2000s?
I would say definitely in the 80s. I would say definitely in
Okay.
the 80s, because I think she would have remembered if it was in the 90s. And so she can't really pinpoint exactly when it is, but
To your
so
knowledge,
she's
to your mother's knowledge, before that statement that he made to her in that car, in her mind, could he have ever been to that point a possible suspect in the disappearance of your granddaughter or your grandmother?
I'm sure. I mean, I think just simply because being a drinker and being that close and being in that area, and how it is, like people talk and
I guess
get a
I guess what
reputation
I'm
for being
saying
a little
is,
off.
I guess what I'm saying is, would they have picked him up if they suspected he caused your grandmother to disappear a few years before that?
I mean, I think that they would have picked him up just because they've known him forever. He was at one point back in like high school and stuff. He had been friends with my uncle, and just like I said, it's just a small area, and they'd known him for so long. I don't think that they would have had. I don't think they would have taken pause like, well, should we give him a ride home? Should we not? It just.
Let's say this was 1986, and it had been
Okay.
5 years since your grandmother disappeared, had his name in those 5 years ever come up that he possibly could have something to do with your grandmother's disappearance?
I would say that it's possible, but then again, I was young, so I can't say for sure. But I would say that it's definitely possible.
Okay. And before
Again,
he
and that's
said that in the car that day, did your mother ever know that he possibly could have killed somebody in his life?
I mean, I guess no. I don't think that she ever would have.
Okay.
Like
I'm
she
guessing
was
she
taken
wouldn't pick
aback,
somebody up that I'm guessing she
though,
wouldn't
that
pick
she
somebody
thought that, yeah,
that had killed anybody, well, let alone if it was your grandmother or just some stranger, probably not.
right.
So,
And and my mom is definitely the type that, like, she's not gonna like hold something against somebody because of some rumors that maybe are going around, or people talking and stuff like that, that she wouldn't have been to like said to my dad like, no, we're not giving this person a ride or whatever. I mean, I guess she would just kind of trust my dad that my dad knew him too and everything, and what harm could it be, right? And so, but no, I know she was taken aback when he said it, like when he made the statement. My mom was just like, oh my God, you know,
Did she take that to be seriously, or did she think he was just in a drunken stupor and didn't know what he was saying?
I guess maybe a little of both. She might have thought that, what in the world is he talking about? And then I'm sure there was a little part of her that was just writing it off, that he was a crazy drunk. And so, and like I said, and this is, a lot of people I've talked to, and that just kind of has a reputation of, spouting his mouth and, just being a little bit off anyway. And she may have just chalked it up to that. And because I remember the first time she's told me the story, and I'm like, and you didn't go and like tell the police? You didn't? And she just kind of shrugged and was just like, well, what are they going to do? He's a drunk spouting off, and that's about, I just kind of feel like at that point my mom was just like, well, they're not going to do anything about something like that.
In the last 30 years since that was first said, has he ever said that to anybody else, to your knowledge?
I don't know about, I can't say for sure. It's a lot of like person hearing it from this person kind of a thing, that there have been times when he's been drinking that my grandmother's name has come up from him himself.
Okay.
And I've heard that from a couple different people, and whatever that, regardless of what was said, that her name has come up, when he has been drinking. And so, we take more pause in it now than maybe what she did back then, kind of hearing more things over the years. But, like I said, at that time, it was just kind of like, what the heck? Like,
okay.
what did he say? And she just kind of was thinking, well, I hope Terry my dad's Terry. I'm sorry. I hope Terry kind of hurries up and gets back out here, because, we just need to get him home and be done with it, kind of a thing. Right.
Were any people at the Trelawney house ever given any lie detector tests regarding your grandmother's disappearance?
The owner of the house he passed.
Let's move on to another. Let's move on to another story. And this.
So we have to back up just really quick.
Okay,
because
please.
We have to go back to the Trelawney party really quick, because
okay.
If you remember, I said there was the owner of the house, and then he said his brother also lived with him.
Okay.
And his brother went to my dad, and I don't know how much longer. I'd have to look at the police reports, because my dad did bring it to the police. It wasn't that long after she disappeared, though, that my dad was out. He was in the bars, and so was the brother. The brother's name was Roger. And Roger approached my dad in the bar and said to my dad, hey, I saw your mother-in-law that night. She was at our house. She was downstairs. I went downstairs, and she was sitting at the kitchen table. And so, of course, my dad takes us to the police to let them know, like, here, you have somebody that was in that house that is putting her in that house. And the police, I don't think, ever went and talked to him. They wrote him off as being simple, having, some type of mental retardation. And
is that true?
He's, I guess, and I've talked to his family too, and my dad knew him, and the way my dad described him initially was that, he doesn't really know if he was really simple. He just talked funny. But, he kind of had all of his faculties about him. He wasn't like, do you know what I mean? He wasn't like mentally, slow in that sense. He just talked slow, and he talked a little bit funny. And so, I talked to some of the family members. Like I said, I spoke to the daughter that was there that night. This would have been her uncle then. And she agreed with what my dad said. She's like, he was fine. You know what I mean? In other words, they could have talked to him, and they could have seen what he had to say, and not just written him off as being, mentally retarded, and that he couldn't offer anything, that indeed he probably was mentally completely okay, and so this is another reason why, my family we kind of go back to that. I believe, some of the family members, and they said that they were upstairs, that she could have come in, that anybody could have come in, and they might not have realized it. I mean, I believe that if they had the music loud, and I mean, their house sits right on the street. It's like super close. And it would have been easy for my grandma to go in and, did she use the phone? Whatever, I don't know. But they said it's very possible. And the fact that this Roger said that he saw her there, that he was so specific to say that he came downstairs and saw her sitting at the kitchen table.
Was she by herself?
Like that. I don't think that my dad ever got much more than that. I don't think that he ever really elaborated on any of it. And like I said, my dad handed it over to the police to have them take care of it. And I think he just assumed that they took care of it and looked into it. And like I said, years later, I get the police report, back whenever I got it, whether it was 2005, 2006, whenever I finally took that step. And, reading through it, and then just realized that they never really did pursue that lead at all.
Is Roger still alive?
No. And the owner of the house, James, isn't alive anymore either.
So these witnesses or people who talked to the police, they've passed away. But unfortunately, Roger said he saw your grandmother there, but he didn't say she was, she might have just been taking a break from her walk. We just don't know. And if Lee Dobson, let's just say for an example, if he was there, it wasn't like Roger said that, well, I saw your grandmother and Lee Dobson was there as well. All he did was he said your grandmother's sitting there presumably by herself.
Hard to say. I don't know. Like I said, I think my dad, I don't think they got to that point. I think my dad, like I said, he went to the police with it and was probably hoping that they were going to dive into the story more and hope that they would take care of it. And then it just never did, and he wasn't questioned. And
okay.
And that's where that lead ended, I guess.
Okay. Let's talk about Norm Kemp, and this has to do with an affidavit from 1988. What can you tell listeners about that?
Okay, so in 1988, Norman Kemp went to the police. Again, he grew up in the area. Norman Kemp did, just down the way. So he's a little removed from National Mine, but only by a few miles or so, right? So he grew up in the area, and he knew my mom. He knew the family and everything, right? And so anyway, he goes to the police in 1988, and in the affidavit, he says that he was reminded of this story. He initially kind of dismissed these statements that he had heard back then, kind of saying that the guy who made these statements to him was old. He didn't really put a lot into it, right? But anyway, that he realized in 1987 that another man had died, a man by the name of Ernie Carlson. And he said he was kind of reminded of all of this, upon the death of, Ernie Carlson, he was reminded of these conversations he had with this other gentleman. This other gentleman's name is Emil Contio. And he said that, these conversations that he had with Emil Contio were about the night that, according to the affidavit, it was about the night that my grandma disappeared. And Emil Contio had told Norman that on the night that my grandma disappeared, he had seen Ernie Carlson on his property, presumably digging for worms. And so, anyway, the speculation was Ernie Carlson driving that night? Did he hit and kill my grandma, and then in a panic state take her and then go and bury her on Emil's farm? He took her and buried her on this farm out back behind, whether it was like a sauna or a barn or something like that. But again, this was all coming from what he claimed Emil Contio had said to him. And so the police went and did a search. I don't know Um, I don't know how well they searched the property, but I do have the report that says they did go out there and they looked around and they didn't find anything unusual or whatever. The hard part about this story is that I remember when we got the police report and we read through the affidavit, and my mom was just very taken aback. My mom was like, "That is not." I was like, "That is not what he told me on the phone." This like story. I mean, it all ended in the same place with her being buried on this farm, but it just wasn't exactly the way that he had told it in the affidavit, not to her memory anyway. And so this would have been, that was 88 that he went forward with the affidavit. This was several years later, so this would have been sitting with my mom in like 2005 going over this maybe, and asking her about it, but she was just like, no. And I asked her again recently. I was like, are you sure you're remembering the story correct, like what he told you? And she's like, it is not exactly the same as what it is in the affidavit.
So Norm Kemp can't keep his story straight between whatever he told your mother, whatever your mother heard, and then when he went to the police and made this affidavit, which is a sworn statement.
Right. And so and that's we were just kind of taken aback on that. And then he actually approached my dad earlier this year. They were at a funeral together. This was back in March. And he asked to talk to my dad outside, and he wanted to talk to him in private. And in the conversation he had with my dad, he definitely made it sound like what he knew about this incident came from Ernie Carlson himself. Because in the affidavit, he kind of does this like roundabout thing, like, well, he talked to Emil Contio, the owner of the property, and Emil was speculating that this area that he saw Ernie Carlson digging in, when he went and checked it, it actually kind of looked like more like a grave, not like just like a place that you would have been digging for worms, right? But everything in the affidavit was coming from Emil Contio, conversations he had had with Emil Contio. And when he talked to my dad back in March, that's not how he made it sound. And my dad came like right to my house after he talked to him. He came right here, and I kind of recorded everything my dad was relaying to me. And that Sarge was, I'm sorry, that's his nickname is Sarge, Norman Sarge Kemp.
Yeah.
His nickname is Sarge. So anyway,
Okay.
Norman was telling my dad how Ernie was really, really drunk that night, and that he felt really, really bad. He felt terrible, but it was an accident. It was definitely an accident. He felt really, really bad. And he was afraid, though, that Ernie was afraid that he was going to be put in jail. So he took her to Emil Contio's farm and buried her behind the barn.
Is that barn still there? Did the Contio still own it? Any chance that you could go out there and search again?
I started looking into that. That has been on my to-do list. So I had that all like after my dad talked to him. And we've been kind of working with somebody. We've been working with somebody that's a former state police individual. And so we've kind of been doing like a step-by-step kind of going through like, where do we want to go? Where do we want to check out? And we're kind of trying to like dot our I's, cross our T's kind of a thing, kind of getting everything lined up before we talk about, searches and stuff like that. I just kind of feel like nobody ever really kind of put much thought into the Contio farm after the police went there and searched and said they didn't notice anything unusual.
What's the reputation of Norm Kemp? Is he a believable guy? What's his local reputation?
I guess that's hard to say. Just a different kind of character again. Has been in trouble with the law before. So I guess kind of had a reputation from that, and just other things too. I guess the same kind of stuff like with Lee Dobson, just kind of makes people take pause anyway, and so I don't know how believable it is. I couldn't say if it's legitimate or if it's a wild goose chase, or I don't know. And so
Do you think it wouldn't be above him to just create a story just for the heck of it?
Again, this is just speculation based on what I've heard over the years. I would say it's possible. I would say it's possible.
And just so we can go through a scenario, it's possible that Ernie Carlson was out there that night that your grandmother was walking, is drinking and driving. He hits her, puts her in his car, and takes her somewhere and buries her. And then somehow Norm Kemp found out about this. Ernie Carlson confessed to him or something like that. That's what the possible scenario could be.
As the story goes, I guess, and it's possible that Ernie Carlson was with Norman's mother that night. They were kind of seeing each other, I guess. At least that's what I've been told. And that I guess these two were friends. That Ernie Carlson and Emil Contio were friends, and that's how he. I guess if you're going to try to figure out why he ended up in Negaunee with a body to bury is, because they were friends, I guess. And but that's what would have put him in national mind that night. Driving on the roads that night, and apparently that it's possible he could have been, driving Norman's mom home. So I don't know.
Let's move on to this. And I know this is, by the way, any lie detector, Norm Kemp ever given a lie detector test? Any of these people that you mentioned in that part?
Not to my knowledge. The only people to my knowledge that were ever given a lie detector test was James Treloar, the owner of the house, and he passed, and my grandpa, which he passed as well.
Let's talk about your grandfather.
Okay.
And I'm just going to say this because, having covered enough disappearances in the past year, you hear about couples who have arguments and then the woman disappears, as you know. Of course, the boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend, the husband, the ex-husband, they're going to be the first person that they take a look at. That's just
of course.
And unfortunately, a lot of the times, the police are exactly right. Women, the FBI statistics show that women are most likely going to be harmed by men they know, and usually intimately. It's like it's well over 50%. You stated that your grandfather passed the lie detector test. However, I'm going to ask you this. Is there anything else that you know about this case that could possibly not make him a suspect besides the lie detector test?
No, other than like I explained earlier, just his demeanor afterwards. And I think that's what, I'd be lying if I said other family members hadn't ever thought about it. Because I know other family members that it crossed their mind that that of course it was possible. Could he have gotten back into his car and gone and find, of course he could have, he had the ability to do so. But, my mom is, and I've asked her very point blank, those are some very hard conversations to have.
Sure.
But she goes back to his demeanor, especially that morning that he showed up at her house, just crying and just like, where in the world could she be? And she said that he was just so distraught because, like I said, that she was his everything, and he was so lost. He couldn't, and so she really just goes back to his demeanor, and that's really all we kind of have, I guess. But I know when you and I had spoke earlier, kind of chatting about it a little bit, I just, for me personally, of course, because I was one, and what am I going to know? But I trust her judgment in it, just because she would have known her father, and my mom is pretty objective. She's, you know what I mean? She's not one to just go by emotion. She doesn't just let emotions dictate, what she believes. And so, I believe that if she truly felt like it was truly possible, that we would have had far more conversations about it than what we have. And it's usually just me kind of like digging and, kind of like trying to find out more. I can be more objective than her, I suppose, because I didn't know my grandma, and I've already stated I wasn't like super close with my grandpa either. So, and I just wanted the truth, and so I've pushed the issue a few times, and I've pushed it pretty hard. And she doesn't get upset. She doesn't anything. She's just very insistent. She's like, pretty much like if you could have seen him and you could have heard the things he was saying, you would believe the same thing I do. So and that's all I really
Mhm.
have to go on. So, um,
I guess because the listeners are going to be, I know what they're going to say. They're going to say, well, they had an argument, and then all he did was call. He really allowed his wife to be out all night. He called, of course, your house to see if she was there, but he didn't call anybody else's house. I think you can put in my position,
right,
of course, as I don't know any of these people. It's something I think about. I'm sure it's something the listeners think about. I'm sure that's going through their mind because those are the questions that come up. You really just let her kind of, because as you stated, as far as we know, she never really did tell him what she was going to do after he drove away from that party.
right.
So he called one person and then it seems he never tried to track her down or anything.
That's
I'm not
right.
married.
Yeah, and
I'm not
oh, sorry.
married or anything, but I know just from my own life, my parents have been married over 50 years. They're still alive. I'm sure they have listeners out there that are the same way. My dad's not going to let my mother stay out all night without going to look and finding her. You know,
And I
just
think, and I literally I just talked to my mom about this like last night because we were talking about doing this interview and stuff like that. And so again, I felt like last night was another night I was like really kind of pushing her on the issue, and she said that night, like that in that conversation that they had, where he's like, where could she be, and whatever, and my mom, I said, why didn't you don't think he got off the phone with you, and why wouldn't he have called somebody else, why wouldn't he have, and my mom was like, she's like, I truly believe I convinced him that, she's like, and I was like, that's how you felt in the conversation. You felt like when you left the conversation, that you had convinced him to just go to bed. Hey, Dad, this isn't the first time that, she's just crashed at a relative's house. You know what I mean? You guys are both drunk, and she just crashed, and we'll find her in the morning. Just go to bed, sleep it off. We'll find her in the morning, and I asked her, I said, and you think that when you left the conversation, you felt like you had convinced him of that? And she's like, yeah, I really do. And so, and I know it's hard. I know it's hard. I know it would be hard for people to accept that, but I have, for the most part, I've accepted it. Do I think there's still a sliver of a chance? I guess. I mean, I guess because it wasn't me. It wasn't me on the phone with him. It wasn't me looking at him and seeing his demeanor, and then the stuff he was doing in the days and weeks that followed, like the stalking, and not really stalking, but like you know stalking around National Mine anyway, trying to
mm-hmm.
peek into people's windows looking for her and stuff. I wasn't witness to that, but he so is not anywhere close on my radar. Just because just too many other things fit more than him, even though statistically it shouldn't. You know what I mean?
Well, what do you think happened? Being that we just brought that up, what do you think happened, Holly? What's your
I mean,
suspicion?
my suspicion is, two things. Either there's some kind of truth into the story that Norman Kemp is saying, whether it was, regardless of who it was that hit her, and then panicked. Like I said, it could have been Ernie Carlson. It could have been somebody else. It could have been somebody that Norman knew and was pinning it on Ernie Carlson. I don't know, but I think that is a strong possibility. I also think it's a strong possibility that it was foul play of some kind. That she stopped at this party. Did something happen downstairs at that party, or did something happen as she walked out of the house? Was she then making her way then to my uncle's house, and somebody intercepted her at that point? Not in a drunk driving situation, but in a I see an opportunity here. I see a woman, by herself walking, and I'm going to, do something here. I'm going to take advantage of this, and I think the reason why I feel so strongly about that's a possibility, is because this is a very small area. This is a very, stuff like this doesn't it doesn't happen here, or at least especially back then, for the most part. But in a very short period of time, there were several women who stuff happened to them, and they were middle-aged to older women, vulnerable, by themselves, kind of a thing, and they were targeted. And the big one, the really big one was a little less than 2 years after my grandma disappeared. In May of 1983, there was a woman in National Mine who was, I'm going to say, brutally attacked in her home. And ironically, she lived right along the route that my grandma would have been walking that night. He left her tied up, and told her at that point that, if she makes any sound, if she tells anybody, whatever, that he would come back the next night and he would kill her. Do I believe that my grandma could have ran into somebody very deviant that night? I really do. I really, really do.
And this man was never located, never identified, nothing.
No, she had very few things to go on. They ran a description in the paper. Pretty much what she could go on was that he was wearing a train conductor type hat. And the other kind of big description that she gave in the police report was that the other thing that she remembered about him is that his eyes were a little closer together. She remembered that feature because it was dark, but she did peek out from under the sheet and look, and she said she did kind of get a little bit of a look at him, but she remembered his eyes being closer together. She was wearing a train conductor hat, and she did not smell booze. She did not smell like booze or beer on him. So it's, we believe that he was not drinking that night. And so there was a bachelor party that was taking place that night, almost right across the street from her house. And so, of course, a lot of the individuals there were questioned in that, and most of them had been extremely drunk, and so most all of them were kind of, not looked into any further because of the fact that they had been so drunk upon leaving the party, and many witnesses to say that that it couldn't have been them, because, like I said, she was very clear on the fact that the individual did not smell of any booze or beer.
Did she say that if she saw the guy again, she would recognize him, or no?
No. And so I think all she had to go on was a shadowy figure, and she maybe got a glimpse of his eyes, and that was about it. And then, like I said, she knew that he was wearing this like train conductor type hat, and that I think that's what made it really hard for the police to kind of close that case, because they had so little to go on.
Were there any other sexual assaults that happened after that one?
After that, I mean, none that anybody has ever like come forward and said to me. Do you know what I mean? Like, I kind of learned about that one. I learned about something that happened in the winter or some months prior to my grandma's disappearance anyway, about a man barging into a woman's home in National Mine, who got kind of scared away because her daughter happened to be there. And so I don't know what the intent there was, or anything, but she too was, middle-aged to older woman. And that, so it just, if you kind of put it all together, I know it's hard not to kind of try to connect them, just because you got a man, it's National Mine, you've got these middle-aged to older women, do you know what I mean, that are kind of...
And nobody was ever caught. It was never pinned on anybody.
No, never.
What's this been like for you?
Frustrating, maybe. I think frustrating, and I think just this past summer has been like the first time I've really kind of felt hopeful, kind of getting some outside help finally. Getting help from somebody that kind of knows the ins and outs of detective work, ins and outs of police work. And so that has been, I mean, I can't say enough, about, his name is Michael Niger, and I can't say enough about him and just how patient he was with my family, me and my sister, who's been helping me with this. This is she and I just kind of where things kind of really got started was when we made the Facebook page. That was her suggestion, and that just to kind of get a lot of this information out there and just kind of stir the pot a little bit. Anyway, I think that's what we were hoping for. And so me, my sister, and my mom and my dad, he asked if he could meet us. We met out in National Mine. We kind of took him through, kind of showing him all the different places where she was going, and that we took him out to where the jacket was found. We, just kind of really gave him a show around, and he was so patient, and he listened to everything we had to say, which is different than what even me myself, what I've experienced over the years. I went to the police, a couple of years ago, with what I thought was a pretty decent lead, and I just kind of felt like it just kind of fizzled out, and so I kind of didn't feel like they were really kind of putting any type of like due diligence into the information I was bringing them, and I just kind of felt like I was kind of being ignored, and so I got a little bit of a taste, in all these years when my mom was like, I kind of felt like I got a little bit of a taste of it, and and I'm sure it's the nature of the story. I know that the detective I spoke to at that time was completely swamped with other missing person cases and recent missing person cases and stuff, and so I can't fault him completely, but it was very disheartening that I wasn't able to get any further with it. And talking to Mike Niger, he's kind of helped me to like, hey, if you want people to take notice, here's some things, so he's kind of walking me through like kind of proper steps to really kind of to get some teeth into it, and to get somebody to like really kind of help us with all the stuff I've gathered over the last 13 years, and to finally get some people looking at what I have and putting it together in ways that I've put it together, like a little piece here, a little piece there, and by itself some of these things are small and maybe insignificant, but when you start putting it all together, it really kind of paints a different picture. So.
And you said you had a website or a Facebook page. Tell the listeners about that, and anywhere else they might be able to find more about your grandmother's disappearance.
Yeah, so like the Facebook page is The Disappearance of Helen Dymond, and that's Dymond, Dymond, not like the kind that you would put on your finger. So The Disappearance of Helen Dymond. And that's our Facebook page. And then also on that Facebook page, you'll find a link to Mike Niger, the individual I said that's helping us. He actually, and he does this all for free. He's amazing. He put together a web page, and it's whereishelendymond.com. So the listeners could go and check it out. He has posted, there's links on there to like the news stories on our local news stations, so like interviews that me and my sister have done, me and my parents and my sister have done. There's even clips out there of news things that came out back in 1981. I went to our local news station and got those VHS tapes. They were kind enough to copy them for me, and I've now transferred them into digital files, so they're out there as well. So those are kind of interesting to check out. And then all the newspaper articles from 1981 all the way through anything that we've done in recent years, that's all out there. There's maps of the area out there that people could look at, where you can like see these pits we've been talking about. You'll be able to see like the main road in National Mine, where the picnic took place. It took place at like where it says Tilden Township picnic area. And that, so they could see stuff like that. So there's that as well. Also, when you go to that page, you will see that he has underwritten himself through his backcountry search and rescue organization, that there is now a $5,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction of if there is guilty parties out there, that there's that reward being offered for information that leads to something like that. So,
any final words, Holly?
No, I guess not. I just, we we take any help we can get. I really keep encouraging people. I truly feel like somebody out there knows something. Put our mind at ease. I just kind of want to feel like if somebody's listening and it was somebody that had a hand in this, send us something anonymously. I've got a P.O. box here in town. It's P.O. Box 600, Ishpeming, Michigan, 49849. Send me an anonymous letter. I think, I would love nothing more than justice, but honestly, I think even more than justice, I think I'd want to know where she is. Just tell me where she is. And at least then we could, maybe potentially give her a proper burial and give my family some type of closure. And so I keep begging, I keep pleading with people because I just feel like somebody must know something. They have to know something. Somebody out there knows, and they've held back for, I'm sure they've held back for reasons that they feel are very legitimate, and in many cases I don't blame them. If they were afraid to get involved, they were afraid to get dragged into something. Maybe they're afraid themselves. Maybe they're afraid of repercussions or whatever. And I guess I'm just begging them, if that's the case, then do something anonymously and just let us know where she is. And if that's the least I can get out of all of this, I'll take it. I'll take that. It may not give me all of the answers, and it may kind of still drive me crazy for the rest of my life that I don't know the full story, but at least I think it would be closure for my family, and I think that they would appreciate it, and I would appreciate it.
Holly, thank you for being on this episode of Unfound.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you for having me on.
You're welcome.
And that was my interview with Holly Letson, granddaughter of Helen Dymond. I thank Holly for being on the program. I also need to thank her cousin's wife, Kaylin, who connected me with Holly. Thank you very much, Kaylin. Long interview. Has to be one of the longest I've done. Lots of info, lots of people involved, many different theories, and at least 3 different suspects. Not to mention that Helen could have strayed into one of those pits all by herself. I was going to do a kind of pluses and minuses thing regarding each of these suspects. Lee Dobson, Norm Kemp / Ernie Carlson, the still uncaught sexual assault suspect, Holly's grandfather Roy. I had it all written out, and it was pretty good. But you listeners don't need that from me. You're intelligent. You have your own minds. You know true crime. You don't need this stuff spoon-fed to you. You can figure this out for yourselves. Instead, I'd like to do something that I think more true crime podcasts should be doing, and that is trying to draw correlations and comparisons between different crimes. Murders to murders, disappearances to disappearances, serial killers to serial killers, conspiracies to conspiracies. You get the idea, whatever the case may be. Because that is how new avenues of inquiry are going to be created, and that's how some of these cases are going to get solved. So, having said that, there was a part of this case that reminded me of another one, and that would be the disappearance of Shane Fell. I hope you all remember his mother Terry on that episode. In that case, a cop came to Terry's house looking for Shane after he disappeared. Remember that? The cop believed that the Fells were hiding Shane. Why? Because I think the cop thought Shane was drinking and driving that night, and he thought the family was helping Shane avoid the charges. A perfectly rational thought. Granted, it wasn't true, and if you'll remember, Terry had a fit that the cop would even suggest that they were hiding Shane, and her other son was ticked as well. They reacted exactly like Holly's mother did in 1981 when the cops showed up accusing her of hiding her mother. They are almost exact carbon copies of each other. What does that tell us? What it tells me is that, as in Shane's case, where the cop had a decent theory, although the cop was certainly wrong, that the cops back in 1981 had a pretty good theory too. They did not show up because they were out of leads, or that they didn't have anything else to do, or they wanted to harass Holly's mother for some reason. Let's put it this way. All of these cops, they know how they're going to look accusing a family of hiding someone. They know it looks bad. They aren't idiots. So they wouldn't do it without a decent theory that can be explained, like in the Shane Fell case. Well, I'd like to know what those 2 cops were thinking in 1981. What was their theory? What was the reason they thought Helen's daughter would hide her mother? I think if we knew the cops' theory, the family would be closer to solving this case, or at least ruling possibilities out. And I'll leave the rest of the theorizing up to you. And that's the program. If you found it informative, please go to iTunes, Podomatic, and or Stitcher and give Unfound a 5-star review. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've been listening to Unfound.